see. Okay, well, let's move to the Middle East and welcome Vanessa to the program. Vanessa, what's been going on in Turkey?
Yeah, in Turkey, well, last week, of course, we were talking about the potential for the meeting of the defense ministers, the foreign ministers, and even potentially the President Assad of Syria. Of course, his red line was that Turkey should remove all military presence, including the extremist armed groups under their control from Syria, and return Syrian territory to the status quo pre-2011. And last week, Turkish officials were a lot more conciliatory, but I did talk about the potential for US interference in the Iranian-Russian brokered peaceful resolution between Turkey and Syria. And in fact, it happened very shortly after last week's program. So suddenly here, we have Erdogan doing another kind of U-turn, which is a familiar element of his presidency. He comes out with the statement, and this is reported in the Cradle: Turks cannot feel safe with PKK, which is, of course, the US-backed, equipped, armed Kurdish Contras in northern Syria and Iraq. But then if we just move on, Mike. So basically, Erdogan on the 17th of April said that his people cannot feel safe in the first place in the presence of a terrorist organization, which is kind of ironic as he's been funding terrorism in Syria since the beginning of the war against Syria, and was training terrorist groups in Turkey. In the presence of an organization in northern Syria and Iraq equipped with air and ground weapons. Now, those air and ground weapons are supplied by another NATO member state, namely the United States. That was reported by Sputnik. He then says, we have shown our determination in this context time and time again, thanks to our continuous operations within our borders and our cross-border operations, which I would say, I mean, if you remember in 2014, Serena Shem was most probably murdered by Turkish intelligence agencies because she was reporting on the Turkish border being used to transport weapons, terrorist fighters, and even chemical weapon ingredients. He says, then we have made it clear that our country cannot live side by side with terrorism, but he will finance it in Syria. We will never retreat from this position, and while we take all these steps, we will not make any concessions at all. Very strong language from Erdogan here, and as I said, a complete U-turn on the language he was using prior to the US got involved in the negotiations, which I'll show in a second. But what is also interesting here, so his big bugbear, if you like, are the Kurdish factions that are under the control of the US in the north and northeast of Syria. But this is from the article that I mentioned last week by Seda Karan for the Cradle. But Erdogan's most striking move to expand his alliance came with Hudapar, which political pundits linked to the so-called Turkish Hezbollah or Kurdish Hezbollah, a deep state-backed movement that carried out terrorist attacks in the southeast of Turkey in the late 80s and 90s. Sometimes confused with the Shia Lebanese Hezbollah. Hezbollah means basically party of God. The Lebanese resistance organization, the Turkish movement, is the polar opposite. It is instead heavily steeped in the ideology of Sunni Kurdish religious extremists, which are also operating in Idlib alongside al-Qaeda. So this just demonstrates the hypocrisy both from the US and from Turkey. And let's have a look at why Turkey might suddenly be changing their rhetoric on Syria. The US has suddenly agreed a $259 million deal of F-16 equipment sale to Turkey. And if we move on, we'll see the details of that. This is from a Reuters article. So US President Joe Biden's administration notified Congress on Monday of the planned sale to Turkey of avionics software upgrades for its current fleet of F-16 fighter aircraft, a deal valued up to $259 million. The deal, first reported by Reuters, moves ahead with the sale of the modernization package for Turkey's aircraft after leaders of US congressional committees gave informal approval. So one assumes that that approval can be rescinded at any moment. And then guess what? Turkey is a long-standing and valued NATO ally, a State Department spokesperson said in a statement. So therefore, they're bringing in the NATO card. They're putting pressure on Turkey to pivot back to NATO after he was showing signs of pivoting towards Russia and Iran. And then it goes on, Mike, in the last section from the article. The F-16 modernization deal follows Turkey approving Finland's accession to the NATO military alliance and signs of easing tensions between Turkey and neighbor Greece ahead of Turkish elections next month. So again, that gives you an idea of why Turkey suddenly approved Finland's accession. Of course, Lockheed Martin Corps will be the principal contractor on the deal. And then importantly here, the smaller package was approved after the administration pushed the lawmakers to approve it to send a positive signal to Ankara, according to one source familiar with the deal. So I think that completely corroborates what I suspected, that the US is trying to step in and muscle Russia and Iran out of the way and to bring an end to any idea of normalization with Syria. Then if we have a look also at Turkey's main opposition to Erdogan and their foreign policy, this is Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, and I'm not going to repeat that name. But if we move on, we'll see a few of the points that they make in their manifesto. It's interesting that Erdogan and his party have not yet produced a manifesto for the election, which is looming. So according to this report in Al Monitor, the opposition alliance, led by the main opposition, CHP, Republican People's Party, pledges to fix the muddle that Turkish foreign policy has become. In a joint policy document, it says its foreign policy will be based on Ataturk's adage. Of course, Erdogan is renowned for basically overturning much of Ataturk's very popular policy in Turkey. Peace at home, peace in the world, and adhere to universal values and international law, free of ideological considerations. The opposition pledges to maintain ties also with Russia, although in the paragraph before that it was talking about strengthening ties with NATO. So again, it's trying to keep the balance between NATO and the new Eastern Bloc that is coming into power, based on a balanced and constructive dialogue on an institutional level. Quite interesting language there. Reference Syria, the opposition pledges to work for the safe return of Syrian refugees as soon as possible, which is a major point for the election campaign on all sides, because the 5 million Syrian refugees are a destabilizing influence for Turkish people. It stresses respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of all regional countries and non-interference in their domestic affairs, but falls short of outlining a roadmap for normalization with Damascus. It promises intense contacts and dialogue with Damascus and opposition representatives, barring militant groups, to help peace efforts in Syria, but says nothing about how it would handle the armed rebel in inverted commas, groups that Ankara has backed. And meanwhile, of course, while the US is trying to derail any peace talks between Turkey and Syria, as I keep repeating, brokered by Russia and Iran, what is the US doing? The US is increasing the attacks by ISIS, particularly in areas in the central desert area of Syria to the east of Homs and close to Palmyra, which of course was taken by ISIS twice during the height of the conflict. This is taken from my Substack summary of what's going on. So the US continues its murder of civilians in central Syria using ISIS proxies. On the 16th of April, at least 26 civilians were massacred in an attack on truffle hunters in the Druzen eastern countryside of Hama. It's reported by the anti-Syrian government Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, SOHI, also funded by the EU, that 12 of the martyrs were members of the National Defense Forces, but majority of the attacks and kidnapped victims are civilians. The US is known to have planted ISIS cells in the area east of Homs, and the threat to civilians or military is high. Syrian civilians, of course, trying to eke a living in a country under economic attack from the West, are forced to hire military protection to survive. Added to this, of course, the desert is also still littered with ISIS and other terrorist group mines and IEDs. On the 17th of February, 53 people were killed in Homs, Al-Sukna, a region near Palmyra, and dozens were kidnapped. And according to local sources, 139 citizens have been murdered since the start of 2023, the majority actually since the double earthquake on the 6th of February. And if you include military martyrs, the death toll stands at an estimated 289. A kilo of truffles, just to give you the idea, on the Syrian market costs between $22 to $65, bearing in mind that most people are earning less than $20 per month at the current inflation rate. And therefore, in such an economic depression, the risks are taken by civilians who would otherwise starve under US sanctions and siege. And of course, this is all part of the ongoing US and UK war of terror against the Syrian people.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that, Vanessa.